I am a public historian. I have been in the field working either in museums or in universities for about 41 years.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi A14, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started with this episode.
I'm a grandfather now. I have 4 kids, 2 granddaughters. My wife and I have been married about 40 years. Okay, 40 years this October. And I've lived probably in 15 different places in my career.
That's lovely. 50 different places.
Yeah.
Anyway, first I want to thank you and I also want to congratulate you. Being a grandfather is not something that happens every day.
No.
And also you'll be married for 40 years. There are a lot of things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of things to celebrate here.
I would say so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with all the people that are getting married today, tomorrow they are divorced, with all the trouble there, you are still there for 40 years. That is a lot to celebrate. Mm-hmm. So now, what we do here is that we go back a little bit to where we are coming from. So where were you born actually in the state?
All right. In the States, I was born in Michigan. I was, my father was an engineer at Pontiac Motors. I lived basically there I never moved at all during my childhood. My parents lived in fact, when they passed away about 4 years ago, they've been in that house for 62 years. It was quite a challenge to clean that out. But we were able to let them stay at their own home, in the home. Our oldest son actually stayed with them for about 2 years to keep them in the house. We were there for about, I was there for my first 25 years of life. My wife and I met in college at Spring Arbor, near Jackson, Michigan. She's a long-term resident of Michigan as well. And when I got to the museum field, I realized I couldn't stay in that same county. So we just really kind of teased about being a mercenary, but we went ahead and just kept going to school and moving to find the next job, trying to stay employed, trying to find the next gig, so to speak, in the field. Yes, I started out as a museum volunteer back in 1981. And that was at a governor's home. And then I got an internship at Greenville Village in Dearborn, Michigan. That's while I was at Eastern Michigan University. At that point, I was getting a degree, an academic degree in geography, and a special concentration in museum education, or what we call interpretation. I did not want to teach at first. That's the last thing I wanted to do. Teaching? Oh, no, not teaching. Oh, please, no, not teaching.
But why? Why?
I couldn't stand school. I didn't like school. Not until I got to college. I hated grade school. I despised high school. Absolutely hated it. I hated the culture. I didn't like going. I didn't think I was very good at it. When I got to college, I loved learning, but I still didn't want to teach. I went to a very good college, small Christian school, Free Methodist school. They insisted that we have a particular concept to approach our learning. And in that way, I was able to kind of, embrace both my faith and learning together. When I got out and went into museum studies, that was perfect because I could interpret history. I could, in geography, I could share it, but I wasn't a teacher. That's what I didn't want to do. So doing that was what I love that one very much. That's what I started out as doing. But early on, I was 27 years old. I became a museum director. I was not ready to do this, but it was with the job that was available. So I had to self-learn again and grow into the role of actually managing a tiny little rural museum in Amherst, Virginia. That was back in 1985. Loved that place. Enjoyed it. I made a great community. I got taught how to politic. I had an old gentleman, Richard Spotswood Pendleton, who took me aside as a young man and said he was an old politician, an attorney, an old Virginia family. Their family had been there for 400 years, took me around and introduced me to senators. He said, Mr. Mack, this is our Senator Shue. And he introduced me to Vance. Well, all these different senators and congressmen, both from the state level and at the national level. So I was learning but as a Virginian, how to politic and how to just speak with people. And in Virginia, you learned how to introduce yourself and ask about family. And you never got down to business right away. You would always engage in conversation, which worked fine in Virginia. It was a disaster in New York State. They didn't care about your family, your kids, or your dog. They just simply said, what do you want, jerk? Just tell me what you want. I don't want to hear anything else from you.
You just get to business, no? This is what you're here for. Just get it done. Quick, everybody go home.
Yeah, so I did not fit well in Virginia. I didn't like it. Or in New York. I didn't like it either. I was in New York State. I said, I didn't like it. I did not like being there at all. But I still learned. What I learned, and I learned about myself as well. And that was I think that's part of the issue there. Let me see if I'm in the right spot for this. But so that's how I got started in working in museums. I did not teach until I lost a job. I was at a museum, a canal site, which I loved transportation history. That was kind of a fun thing of mine. I love boats and river transportation. I got so excited at this first job because we made what you call a bateau, just French for boat. But it was a type of an agricultural craft, very common in colonial America. It's basically a canoe built out of planks and ribs. It's a very, So I got very excited about river transportation and canal. Oh, that was just fun for me. So working on that, I got more and more into what we call in America material culture studies. And my work, I did not do much with documents. What I did, my strength and my research source was particularly objects, using archaeology, using old buildings, fence, anything that's material, human generated, human modified, human made material culture. And that's what I became very good at. That's by, I said, mid-late 80s. I really became an expert in that area.
Thank you so much for that.
Oh, sorry,
okay. No, we appreciate that. In this podcast, we pay a lot of attention to history because history tells us a lot of things of where we are coming from, so that we better project where we are going to in the future. But of course, today we are looking at public history. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a background of what public history is? Help us understand that.
Right. Public history is a type of target audience, a target for history. There is traditionally in American historiography or in American history culture, back from the early 20th century, even 19th century, if you worked at a historical society, if you worked somehow with the public, you're a historian, but you worked with people who were not specialists, you were third rate. You are not really a historian, you're a public historian. Therefore, because you're with the National Park Service, with historical societies, you may be very good. You may even have a PhD, but you are not doing what you're supposed to do. It's really not until the late 80s that I start seeing university and scholars beginning embracing this public history. And the public, this is that I am not targeting my research and my writing, my talks. I'm not targeting it for the academic world or the grad students. I don't, they can listen to it fine. I am targeting people who like history or might not even think they like history. They don't know they like history, but all of a sudden, when they realize their community, their family, and it's relevant, they love this field. They love history. Public history links the best research with a non-specialized audience. It's a little bit more like my personal definition. There are some more academic ones, but we're looking at who am I talking to? I'm not talking to the academics. I'm talking to people in the neighborhood. I'm talking to the various groups around me. I'm talking to those who are not specialized historians, but they have an interest. And so the museum, the historical society, the community club, the church, all sorts of other groups that are not academic, not university, are tied into this. This is where it does become a different kind of history, but it's the audience, not so much the subject matter, but it's also how the subject matter that is presented. I'm using language, I'm using a different format, I'm using exhibit, I'm using storytelling, narrative of various sorts to show what history is. And this is different from traditionally academics. And it's meant for engaging a different type of audience.
I'm trying to understand what could be the role of public historians in the society like we have it today.
There are a lot of academics still doing this now. I've noticed several key scholars having programs, and they're using history. In fact, right now, because of the political turmoil the United States is going through, they're using history as a way of explaining or viewing, like walking backwards through time. We had an insurrection on January 6th, and this hearing is going on right now. There's some very good historians who specialized in political history. And they're going back to not really just the Civil War, but they're going back to the election of 1800. They're going back to controversial elections of 1824, 1828, 1877. And they're looking at those kind of crisis moments and say, okay, what did we learn there? What quirky things do we have here? And we realize that, for example, we have we have racial overtones. We have certain kinds of attitudes in our culture, both that are pseudo-religious, both that are exclusionary. And we try and trace back how do those things, what happened then? We look at terrorism. An article came out recently about a lesser-known terrorism of Italian terrorists who tormented throughout the United States in the early 20th century. They sent bombs to people everywhere in the government around the country. So we had terrorist groups back in around, but prior to and just after the First World War. It's the public historians who kind of reminds us, okay, here's what we did then. Here's what's going on here. And living in context, like walking backwards in time, but creating this context for events that are current. So that you're gaining a bit of wisdom. It's like being a 100 and 200-year-old grandparent who says, now, just a minute now. Here's what happened. And this is good news. This is bad news. Helping us grasp the depth of what we're going through right now, that this is not entirely unique, or what is unique and what is not unique. Again, it's like having a long grandparent who adds a little bit of wisdom. Maybe that's what I'm looking for, a bit of wisdom that is helping us grasp what we're going through. I cannot foretell the future. That's not our skill. We can tell you what the past was like, and it adds the context to the present. Then you got to figure out what's going to happen in the future from that point on. That makes sense?
Yeah, makes sense. I want you to remain there for some time. How do you get the materials that you use to interpret the future? Because you were not there, no? Because now probably as a historian, you're going to be talking of something that happened like 300 years ago before you were born, 1,000 years ago. How do you get the material to be able to explain this to people?
There are three, I call it generalized sources. I'm one of the few who actually lived through working on all three because of my career. The common one is documents, the primary source, papers, monuments, or inscriptions. And these involve deep dives into, for example, I did a project years ago about Memorial Day, and I spent weeks going through newspapers printed in one town, and I would look through every single weekend or every single event that looked at Memorial Day. So I went through like 70 years of newspapers describing Memorial Day events. Historians do this all the time. Dr. Heather Cox Richardson, she'd gone through the Congressional Globe, works of Congress, newspapers from a particular event or particular location, and just read every single front page, back page, or certain middle page, reading just for decades and decades, one paper, diving into what was said, taking copious notes in this thing, and then trying to analyze what that paper was trying to tell about. Not assuming that may or not be true, but what were they trying to portray? And then you match that with other sources, other primary sources going at the same time. So it requires literally years. So you ask, why did it take so long? Well, it's years of reading. You're diving through until you become so familiar with certain kinds of papers or certain kinds of documents that you know what's coming up in time. You almost hear the voices. People who read Lincoln that way, they read every speech he ever read, wrote, talked about, until you start knowing that voice. Now that's the papers. Then there's the tough one, oral history. We look at slave narratives in the United States. This had to be done by oral histories, and there was a ton of these done in the 20s and 30s, where people began interviewing those who had survived enslavement, and thousands of hours of narrative trying to get just a little bit about that. So we have oral histories. And then you have other narratives, such as the abolitionist literature, or you have other newsletters and documents, reading those. And then finally, material culture, archaeology, analyzing the various areas that you're looking at, or architecture, geography, using those sources to try to analyze what survived over the centuries. So all those together start helping you construct, but it's not a science, it's an art. You're rebuilding the past based on the documents, based on bits and pieces of oral history, based on material survival, knowing that each one of those is slanted and skewed toward some fate that has altered their survival. Why did the paper survive? Why did the artifacts survive? Why did the oral history survive? Knowing that, I have to realize every one of my sources is limited and in some ways is slanted. Then I'm having to kind of become so familiar with them and the matching and the conflicts in order to construct my story. And it's taking years to do that, but you're using all those types of varying sources together. In conjunction, in conflict, in order to construct a narrative that makes sense, that's beginning to kind of put together. And you're looking at a very complex story that it's not simple to understand. For the past, people who lived 100, 200, 300 years ago, their world was just as complex, convoluted, and disturbing as ours is now. Remembering that helps us kind of grasp what that past was actually.
All right, Mr. Tom, I have this question like this. Do you think when we are writing story, we are writing it for ourselves to understand, or do we write it for those who will be here after us to understand?
In ways, both. I have to be able to grasp something. But then I know that whoever comes after me will revise it. Now, it's a dirty word sometimes, but it is essential. If a historian can't revise, you're not doing anything. Because for each generation to understand that event or story, whether it be, and this is global, whatever country you're in does this. I want others to understand it. I have to understand it first. Grasp something. With the humility to know that somebody is going to come after me and they're going to need to revise. Because they're going to understand something better than me. Each age is going to have to look at this, and the questions they're going to ask about the event And I said, I'm not sure, where you're talking from, but whether it be in any continent, we're battling with our own histories, and we're revising it as we go on, either because the evidence changes, or often because the questions my clients, my people around me are asking are different. They have to know something different. And now it means that there are great old histories that we should read. In fact, the best historians will look at the old histories, knowing that they're flawed now, but there's some wonderful points that they have found that I need to consider and look at as I start doing my revision. And as my great-great-grandkids will do the same thing to me. Maybe one of my granddaughters will be a historian, and she is going to look at, oh, Grandpa said this. And she's going to find new things to look into because she's living in another generation. And she has to ask another question. Now, there might be some wisdom I'm going to provide that my age provides, but it's not the full answer. And the history is never, we're always, as St. Paul says, seeing through the glass darkly. We do that on our own history as well. And to recognize that's why revision is absolutely an essential part of writing history. You cannot do it without revising. That must be done every generation, even if it's minor.
Mm-hmm. All right. Revision is very important. It's crucial. I'm trying to understand. You see, before I was asking, how do you collect the information that you use to reinterpret the present? Okay. Of course, we're talking about public history now. Yeah, the collate. Now, do you have you heard of the term before that some people didn't have history?
They don't have history.
Yeah, did you hear a term like that before?
Yes.
In this sense, usually it was, okay, maybe there are some European historians at the time will say Africa didn't have history. That is where actually I'm going. As a public historian, if you were to examine such a statement, what would be your take?
I'm rather horrified because every culture has history. I mean, every culture may not even have math, but they've got history. And that might be how they do it, because ancient world, not just Africa or Europe, Asia, there are stories. There are narratives, stories passed down from elder to younger. The Hebrew were commanded to tell stories to their younger. Now, it may be the only source. That's why I said sometimes we study even a character in America like Abraham Lincoln, who's well known. There's a whole genre of writing about Lincoln based on oral studies. Who remembers what? The tales. Now, they're harder to use because I have to know how far, I've got to use it, figure out, but I can't ignore it. It must be, therefore it is a history. If a culture has no language, there was a past. I mean, the past existed. I mean, that to say there is no past is absurd. There was a past. But how do I find out about that past? And it depends on the tools I have. I might be only using oral history and tales. Myths are not necessarily false. They are great tales. I have to learn how to read them, how to analyze them. And then I might use other sources like archaeology, but I have to mesh them with the tales too. And then I'm in for a real, wild ride, because those aren't easy to mesh. But I have to, that's what I've got. But there is a history. It doesn't mean there's no history. It's there. Because there is a past. Therefore, there must be a way of telling about that past, which is history. To say no history means somebody saying, well, there's no written record, therefore it doesn't count. That's unfair. Just because there's no written record does not mean there's no history.
I agree with you.
That's unjust. That's unjust.
Mm-hmm. Also, it is not even, it is not correct.
Very much so, but it's wrong. but it's an unjust. But it's injustice to somebody. Wait a minute. You just got to learn how to read what their history is. It means you've got to use other sources. So get over yourself. Every place has history. Every place has history. I just have to learn what the source is, what my tools are. It might take a generation. It might take longer. It's going to be tougher. But just because it's not written down does not mean it's not history. That's a terrible thing to say.
All right. Now, when you go around to look for historical evidence or things that you will use to construct a history, a story, what do you usually look out for? I mean,
Oh wow.
this might be very generic, I know, but it is important for me. So help
Well,
me.
right. Okay. I do this, and this is because I'm an odd duck. Okay. There are those who might not like what I'm doing, but I grew up, in fact, instinctively doing geography as my first source, history, material objects. I go to a new town, and it could be, whether I was touring in Japan, where I was in Asia, whether it's in Europe. I look at stuff. I look at streets. I look at plants. I look at people. I look at the physical world around me. And I'm looking for things that have used to be. All right. I'm looking at relic features, things no longer used. Those fascinate me beyond belief. I look at what's not used anymore, but still there. What pieces are there? I look at language. Language can tell us a lot about the past. Expressions that are maybe not grandparents' expressions, great-grandparents' expressions in different languages. That is an evidence. That tells me a lot about the past. We have expressions in America and in Europe in the English language that are not used much, but when you know those expressions and you kind of dig into it, oh, there was a tradition, a package of thoughts, of assumptions that tell us about our past. Those aren't easy. Social history is a very hard subject to work with, but it's how I begin to find the past in other cultures that may or may not have left a written record. We do it in the United States, particularly looking at the enslavement history. And we look at, or any minority groups that didn't leave a written record. And so I have to read around things. I have to look at records about them, knowing it's going to be badly slanted, but then I have to kind of play with that. But my first thing is I always look at stuff. If I'm in a new place.
All
Okay, go
right,
ahead.
Tom, I have a curiosity like this. When I want to go is this, then of course I'm going to just play around a little bit.
Yeah.
Is whether history is actually recorded based on the on the version of reality of a people. Okay, what I mean is this: if you were to take a book today, 2022, a book that have been written today, and we take it back to like 2,000 years ago, and we were to read this book to the people, we probably just narrate to the people, no? Not the
Yeah.
book. Maybe somebody would have read this book and then speak to the people in the language that they will understand. Now, is it possible that maybe, like you were saying, maybe in a certain culture, they have their own reality of life, their own way of documenting or passing down history?
Yeah.
Now, we want to understand that history, that we need tools to be able to decode their own culture, their own narration, so that we'll be able to understand it. Of course, this is sort of related to what we were saying before, that because I don't understand how you live, how you construct yourself, for me, if I am a rude person, I can say you don't exist. Whereas it's actually a deficiency on my part because I am not able to understand you. Instead of looking for a way to understand you, I say you are not there. So the question really is it possible that we are all writing history according to our sense and sensibility,
We
according
do.
to our understanding,
Yeah.
according to the instrument that we have?
We do. But one of my first graduate lectures I attended, Dr. David Lowenthal, called History of Foreign Country, the past of foreign country. It's different. It's drastically different. But if I go to a place the first time, I don't know the language, I don't know the people, not sure what I'm looking at. I'm approaching it like I did the past. I'm wandering around like a tourist. But I hope to be an engaged tourist, and therefore I got to find somebody from there who maybe help me learn the language. Give me names for things. And then to be absorbed in that foreign place. No matter how foreign it might be, I have to kind of become enmeshed in it. I have to belong to it as best I can. Never fully belonging, but yet trying my best to belong. Learning to communicate with that particular place, that foreign place, until I start to have a few glimpses of what they're like. To see the world in their eyes a few times. Imperfectly, flawed, but bit by bit, I start to gain a little bit of understanding of what that place is like. I have to do it by putting myself there. I cannot do it from over here. I'm always going to get, and my tools might be from here, for example, but I have to live in that spot best I can. I treat the past as a foreign country, a foreign location, a new planet, even. And sometimes if I spend long enough, and sometimes I'll never get it. But I have to recognize I didn't get it. I don't understand it. But it does not mean they're not there. It does, yeah. Just because I don't get
please
it
go.
doesn't mean they're not there.
It appears now that somebody who is a kind of a public historian, somebody who is, it looks like a kind of a calling, in the sense that you are going to be very careful because the land that you are trailing is very delicate. It's not just boldly written, this is it, this is not. You are going to have to make sense of it at the end of the day. So it requires a high sense of humanity in you to be able to humanize every human. Otherwise, you run, because if you don't understand this now, you run the risk of saying, oh, it's not there. No, don't pass beyond there because there are no human beings, no?
Yeah.
When we look back to your days, when you were still young, can you tell us anything about how you look at history then, when you were still young? What was, how did people look at the study of history then, maybe compared to today, 2022?
I grew up in a very white community. And even though I liked history, I didn't really know what it was. Which is what a lot of us do. We look at the past kind of in a jaundiced meaning. It's a series of images. Almost like watching a movie, but there's only one take. I looked at the past as the way I was taught, in a rather clear way that it's only really one way to look at it. In fact, I was much embarrassingly old when I still thought this, that history should be completely nonpartisan. It doesn't matter what party you belong to, what faith you belong to, that history was always the same. Wow, was I wrong? Yeah. And it's embarrassing to admit it, but I had a very limited view as to what history constructed. I thought of in a certain way, a certain genre, a certain format, and that should be fairly simple to grasp. And I've seen others say the same thing, and I realized, but it took me years. It took losing things. It took bumping my head a lot of times. And it took advanced studies and other people looking at me. And it took other people to say, well, that was stupid, Mackie. Come on. It took a lot of losing things, basically, in order to grasp that the past was far more complex and very even fuzzier than I thought it was. Once I began looking at it, and also looking at histories that are drastically different from my own, then I realized, well, these are still people. There are no not people. Therefore there is history. simply because to get to the point where I said I couldn't understand it yet was humiliating. But I rather realized that it was an art. Once I got past that history is not a science, then I could kind of grasp better the humility I needed to step back, take time. It was not going to be rushed. Every time I studied something new, and I think because I moved 15 times, I kind of got bumped into this. So that when I looked at other countries, other cultures, in their times, then I realized, wow, this is never ending. There is no end to the study here. There is no possible end to the way you can look at this. It is constant, and it's a struggle. But yeah, I look at my past and I'm like, oh my gosh, what a dummy I was. I just did not. I was too simplistic. But all kids are simplistic in many ways. You're kids. That's why you're simplistic. You haven't aged. You don't have the white hair yet. But I'm still a kid in many ways. I'm still finding things I bump into and go, oh my gosh, I can't even begin to understand this yet.
All right. Now, I want you to define history to a young kid who is listening to you.
Ooh.
That kid doesn't understand yet what we are talking about.
Yeah.
Give it a description. History.
My granddaughter. I talked to my granddaughter, and she is now 5, almost 6. I talk about, well, this is when your mama was little. This is when your grandpa was little. This is when your grandpa's grandpa was little. Using generations that she has seen, bit by bit, she can then envision before her. It has to be concrete. Young children are concrete learners. They are set. They memorize. They love to memorize. They love to set things. If they can see my daughter, who is her mom is before her. She understands that. Grandpa is her daddy. Her daddy is before her grandma. She can see that. It adds it forms a concrete timeline that is before her. It takes her a while, but she knows there is a before her. And therefore, a before her mom, a before her daddy, and a before her grandpa and her grandma. And these are stories. Stories are the way to link it. And if I link it to a generation that she can see, she begins to understand the past as before her. That's as far as you can normally get. When you hit to about 3rd, 4th grade, the abstract learning begins to come into some kids. And so I can go from the story of your mom, your dad, your grandparents, before them. They can begin to see longer past. And she knows that certain buildings are before her. She has a generalized concept of before her, older than, and so she looks at certain buildings and she recognizes them as relating to the generations of one of us. That's how she's beginning to understand the past. But she has to use it in a concrete way. It's her parents who are before her grandparents who are before her. They know things before her. It's concrete. It's stories. And it must be story. And we're finally getting it in some museums. They're using stories again. It says, yes, okay, finally. And that's how you relate to those who at the very, very earliest stages. I do that to my math students who hate history. The nurses who really hate history. And I use the story before you. Just like I did my 5-year-old. And I look at the eyes of my nurses who hate history, who are terrified of this class. And they're finally getting it. Just a little bit. It's not as terrifying as they thought.
There is power in simplicity. Yeah. When it is simple, it is powerful.
Do you
It
know how long
doesn't.
it took me? That was a long time coming.
You know, I really need to know a lot to be able to make things simple. Otherwise, people hang in the highest sounding vocabulary where they confuse themselves or they confuse also the people around them.
I was in his very last class he taught at Western Michigan, Dr. Ernst Breisock. Wise old gentleman, taught philosophy and history, terrified most students. I loved him dearly. He said, history needs to be elegant literature. And if you cannot explain this to a third grader, go back and start over because you don't understand it yourself.
That is very important. Somebody should write that down.
I have.
Thank you so much, dear Tom. I really appreciate that. Okay, now, what is your work as a historian? Can you take us around a little bit how you go around to do your work as a public historian?
Right now, I'm not really employed much. I teach, but I'm still a public historian, which means I get the classes that they're not majors. They don't know history, and they don't like it. Therefore, I construct the readings, I pace them, and I use talks to tell stories. I use stories. When I worked in a museum, I learned stories. I went to a new community. I simply listened. I looked at things. I listened to older people. In fact, I understood our race relations by keeping my mouth shut and my ears open. I listened to families that were finally able to talk to me because I knew their kids and were friends with them. And I learned horrible things. I learned wonderful things about what it meant to be African American in the United States. It wasn't until, because I knew very few, and I finally got into the community. It took years. I had to just listen, and I guess I've gotten pretty good at that, although I do talk a lot. I love to listen to older stories. And that's basically what it means to be a public historian at the first stage. Lots and lots of listening, particularly when you're in a first stage. You're in a foreign country. I've got to just get my binoculars, my camera, my tape recorder, sit down and talk to people as much as possible. Think about what I'm listening to. Ponder, reflect at what I'm listening to. Pray about what I'm listening to. Dear Lord, what have I got myself into? And then I've begun to see more complete pictures, like a puzzle, with no box to cheat on. I just have an empty bag full of puzzle pieces, and I go, well, these are edges, and this is, I kind of, okay, there's my edge. Okay, I don't know if it's top edge or bottom edge. I have no idea, but it's an edge, And these 7 pieces fit together. Okay, there we go. Let's see. And you just have to listen and listen. And that's what I did as a public historian. And even an academic does the same thing. I mean, the really good public historian or academic historians in politics, for example, they just simply read and read copiously. They read other historians, but they read newspapers, they read speeches, they read the congressional record to the point of, ad infinitum ad nauseum, on and on at the point of puking. They just grab it and keep going at it until something finally begins to take shape. And it's a long, tedious process.
Yeah, I can imagine it. Yeah.
So when somebody says it's this simple, I get really kind of frothy angry at that because no, it's not. You have no idea what you're talking about. There are many of us who spent 40, 50 years in one subject. I'm a bit of a flibberty gibbet. Because I was in museums, I had to keep learning new things. I feel like I've done good at nothing, one. Because I've had to keep moving around and changing subject matter a lot. So if I do have a a wider span, but I often feel guilty that I don't have any depth sometimes. But my wife teases me, no, you just don't understand how deep you've gone, over these years. I guess it's like going to a foreign country. You have to listen a lot. Whether that listening is reading and reading, or literally if you're in a community and you don't know it yet, doing public history, like a neighborhood, for example. My own neighborhood I live in is a 120-year-old neighborhood near East Side, Indianapolis. And I look for as many older folks that I can find that have lived here at least 20, 30 years and just ask them questions or listen to their stories about living in the neighborhood. I found some folks who've been here, 50 years ago. Now I can ask them deeper stories, a little more. And I just look around, and bit by bit, I'm trying to construct in my head what this area was like in 1960, what the area was like in 1950. And using other tools, random odd tools. Music, for example, can be just putting these things, trying to put the environment together. One of my favorite things to do as a public historian, if I did an exhibit and I wasn't sure what to do, I would find music from the same time period I was looking at. And I would have objects and music put together. And you're almost beginning to create the environment, almost like for a zoo, human zoo. Trying to create the environment first and see what fits in here, and just kind of wander around in this environment, kind of getting a feel for the place. And sometimes that's all I can do right now. Just get a feel for the place and have people, come on, join me. Come on, let's wander around this together. Here's some music from 1930, 1920. These buildings are all 1920. What do you feel? Get a feel, and that sometimes that's all and we can do it together. What's wonderful now is I'm listening to museums, getting people on their boards, getting, non-specialists. They're just kind of people who live there. They have some vested interest in keeping this together, so they're hanging out with you. And you're doing this together. You're trying to understand this community together. Their part, your part. Yeah, I'm a specialist in some areas. I have a lot of expertise in some areas. But blast it, I've got to listen to others who have a vested interest in here as well. And we can explore this community together. Learn about it together, because I don't know all the answers. I've got to have friends who are also vested in this community with me. And we can learn together to grasp what is this like before us? Like telling my granddaughter, okay, what was before us? What's before me? And before my grandparents, before your grandparents and great-grandparents. Bit by bit, we take it back. Trying to grasp what this area is like. That's public history.
All right. That's public history. Now, I can see all the energy that you're investing in, the time, the years and years you need to put in to be able to condense it down to almost a simple thing. But there is nothing simple actually in it. To be able to do this, what does it require? Is it a natural curiosity that you need to train? Tell me about it.
My professor, he knew I didn't want to teach. This dear gentleman, Dr. Turman, I love that gentleman. He was my first mentor. He taught me the Spring Arbor concept, engaged community. But the first thing was passion, that this is what I've got to do, even if I never get paid to do it. I've got to do this. It's a calling. My mother wanted me to be a pastor. I was never called to be a pastor. My sons-in-law are pastors, but I'm not. My desire was history. And the history geography is kind of a blending with me. I blurred the two together. I can't draw a line between them. There is no line. But the passion and this irresistible urge, I've got to see what's beyond the next age. Like the geographer, a real geographer describing the earth, I need to see what's beyond the next block, the next hill, and describe that too. like a biologist finding a new plant, I've got to be finding a new spot on the earth to understand better. A new age, a new event, a new something. And I keep digging around looking for, okay, who's been here before me? And I see the old history. And then I get excited because I see a diary. Oh, yes. He was here. Yes. Okay. And I dive into the diary. There's this great little diary from Canandaigua, New York. Carolyn Carls Richards. Little young girl who grew up and had a wonderful way with words. And she wrote a 20-year diary of living in Canandaigua, New York. Oh, it's priceless. Through the eyes of a young lady, 13, 14 years old, 15, 18 years old, 21 years old, living in that same community, writing every week. Wonderful eyes to see through. And then you simply dive into that diary until you know it really well. And then you go to that, but you also then have to have somebody wiser than you who says, all right, now we're going to do this systematically. I've been here longer. I want you to read these 73 books, And books are important, but realizing that's not the end all and be all. I have to read the books, I have to critique the books, but then I have to keep listening. So I'm going back and forth. I'm listening, I'm reading, I'm critiquing, but I have somebody else older than me who says, wait a minute, have you thought about this? And we're always doing this to one another. History field is, we're cruel to one another sometimes. I'm working on a book right now, and reviewers are quite cruel in some areas. Some I disagree with. No, I think you're wrong, but I've been at this a while. You grow up reading. You grow up listening. You have to go through the rigmarole of a graduate degree to be a historian. There's no way out of it. Now, a lot of people have gotten very good in one subject without ever going to school much. I know some people who've done wondrous work on Lincoln who have not specialized graduate-wise school with Lincoln, but they have read him so deeply. They've listened to all the experts. They have read the experts' books for decades and decades and decades. And in a sense, they have earned a graduate degree unofficially because they have read so much. They have listened so much. I'm thinking of a historian who studied Lincoln. Very sophisticated gentleman, doesn't have the graduate degree for it, but he really just, oh my goodness, just spent so long reading and listening and memorized Lincoln's writings. Just
fully into it.
Into it for 50. He's been doing it when I was an early teen, okay? But, I was like 14 when he started diving into this thing. So, over 50 years of deep reading. And you become very good. Lincoln himself was not schooled often, but he read deeply and often. And so he schooled himself. And I guess all of us do that, even though we've been to graduate school, which rushes us along, I think. But there is no replacement for your sitting down on your own, after you've been beaten on perhaps, but sitting down and reading books deeply, old books and new books. The primary sources, reading through a particular favorite time period of sources, and just simply diving in, taking notes, trying to put your head into that time period. And for me, the objects, even if I only have them in pictures, but better yet, if I can get to the location. And then listen again.
All right. We are going to listen. We are really going to listen. Look at it. There are two. One here, one here.
Yeah.
It is for us to listen so that we have only one. If we just look at the human being, look at the environment, there is a lot that we can learn. But sometimes we just close our eyes and think that we know everything. No, we don't know everything. All right. Now, I have this question for you like this.
Okay.
You started to do this work. You had this curiosity, but you continue to train yourself. When was the moment you realized that this was the thing you really want to do? Really want to pour yourself in? Share with me.
Oh, I had a mother. Oh, dear lady. She was a simple lady down in Tennessee. She and her husband never finished high school. In fact, didn't even finish middle school. She had a very bright little boy. He was 6. He loved history. He asked deep questions, a lot of things. And she asked me, she said, "Oh, Mr. Mackie, I don't know what to do. How do I raise this boy? He's brighter than his pa and me." And I said, "Get him a library card. Take him to museums. God has already wired this boy to learn. He's already got the heart wiring. You just simply have to love and support him through it. He will do the rest." Trust me, he will do the rest. And she said, "Well, Mr. Mackie, when did you first realize you loved history?" I was age 4. I could tell you about the Union Jack, my grandparents' flag. I knew that was my grandparents' flag, and it was across of St. George and St. Andrews and St. Patrick. I could tell you that this uniform in front of me was a British uniform. It's from the War of 1812. I didn't understand when it was. I didn't understand time, but it was before me. As soon as I was understood before me, I was hooked. I was in high school. I didn't know what to do with my life. My dad, poor father. He was an engineer. He knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't know what to do with me, though. So he took me around, but to all these career days, nothing looked good to me. I wanted history. I didn't know what to do with it until after college, I was interviewed for a master's program. And this dear gentleman, geographer, explained to me heritage interpretation. He says this was to take all the complex of history, all its sources and forms and objects, and make it understandable. And I screamed out, "Eureka! That's it!" Whatever it took to look at the past, its complexity, its reality, pull it forward into our time and make it understandable. And I screamed out, that was what I wanted to do. And forever after that, that's what it put what had been growing and growing and growing in me for years, and finally became a eureka moment for me. Well, this professor, Eastern Michigan, I probably startled him because I jumped. That was it. To interpret, instead of a language, to interpret a before us time, to bring it forward so that I can see what came before. And all of a sudden, my past starts to gel and make sense. The stories start flooding me, and I start flowing many, many, many stories. And all of a sudden, my present doesn't seem so frightening any longer, because I have now got the image from my grandparents' perspective, my great-grandparents, my ancestors' perspective, more and more. Oh my gosh, how did I get here? I now have a better grasp. I take a deep breath because all of a sudden things start to make sense a little more. It's frightening, it's overwhelming, it's flooding, and yet now things start to make a little more sense. It's more frightening and less frightening all at the same time.
Thank you so much. This is a full lecture. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for interviewing me. I feel honored to be called.
Of course, we have more to talk about. Anyway, for people who want to start learning about history, who want to start understanding the value of history, what would you recommend for them?
Understand the value first. Realize that all pasts have to, be grasped. And I would just start with your own. Many people get into history through genealogy, understanding their own family, being able to assemble a timeline of who I came from. And then the context of those who came from. How did my parents live? How did my grandparents live? What was their world like? Bit by bit, you begin to assemble contexts of this. One of the lessons historians have to grasp, and it's hard to grasp, this one took me a long time, is the idea of contingency, meaning if I look at other pasts, it didn't have to happen that way. Some people made choices that changed history. How did I make choices? How did my parents make choices? Then I started looking at others far from me who made choices that changed history, that changed the trajectory of the future. Beginning to piece that together, that's kind of how I would start. If you're not sure, if you're, even to value history, look at your own past and realize what has happened before you that has impacted you. And then you realize that every other person in the universe has that same experience. Every politician you've run across, every wealthy character, every major celebrity has a past like that. They've had lots of influence, but okay, who has influenced them? How have they been influenced? And then you begin realizing, past is profoundly valuable. Every crisis we've gone through has a past. It has a timeline of complex, messy, disastrous, or whatever events leading up to it. It did not happen suddenly. Nothing happened suddenly. Everything has its own past, its own lead up that has to be grasped or even to remotely understand how you get.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
History, being a public historian, has been my life's work. It is not paid very well all the time. And I've had a hard time staying gainfully employed. At this point in life, I'm now looking for work and trying to construct a career again in my somewhat senior years. Not too senior, I hope. But it's still what I do. So somebody asked me, what do you do? Well, I'm a public historian. This is what I do. This is what I do in my free time. It's what I do in off time. It's just me. It's who I am. That kind of, everybody has to look at the world through some skilled eye set. My father was an engineer. He looked at it through engineering structure. I look at things through the past, but I look at it in a way that is a little more open than an academic historian would do.
That's powerful. Thank you so much for that. Okay. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate you finding me. I was surprised that this is interesting. Okay, sure. I'm game.
If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening and talk to you in the next episode.